In this video, I'm going to be showing how I made a solitary rugose coral, otherwise known as a horn coral. And this is one of a series of videos on how to make inexpensive models, relatively easy to make models for primarily for small museums, collegiate museums, historical society museums, etc., that may not have the resources to buy sophisticated models or to hire design firms to make them. So these would be the kinds of things that would be used in dioramas or maybe in teaching. In the case of the horn coral, a lot of people confuse them for teeth, animal horns. Some even say they look like carrots and wonder if they're plant remains. And so having a model to show someone that it is actually a coral and give them an idea of what it might have looked like when it was alive. So this is the first model that I've built using polymer clay. And so this is definitely not a refined method on my part, but it produced a satisfactory result with some learning that went on that will improve the next ones. But the materials, and so polymer clay is a type of clay that remains workable until you bake it. And different brands and types of polymer clay may require different baking temperatures for different lengths of time. So you'll have to follow the instructions on whatever brand or type that you use. And even within brands, there are different types and it may have different baking requirements. But the beauty of it is that you can work on something until it comes until such point where you're going to damage it if you work any further. You can throw it in the oven. It will harden into a hard plastic-like consistency, and then you can build onto it and so on and so forth. Or you can bake pieces and so on and then build it into the rest of it, from my understanding. And there are different types of within polymer clay. There are different consistencies and types and so on, softer and medium and hard. And but based on what I've learned, the Super Sculpey is pretty good for all of my applications. Sculpey is a brand. So for this project, I used aluminum foil, the Super Sculpey polymer clay, a thin yet stout wire, various sculpting tools, many of which you could probably find around the house or lab, but there are some really handy ones that you can buy extremely cheaply online. You can get a whole handful of different tools for $10 or less. An oven for baking, and you know, you might not want to put it in the oven that you eat out of. You'll have to research that and find out whether that's appropriate or not. I use the laboratory oven, and acrylic, cheap acrylic paint. So the horn coral that I'm modeling here is essentially an Ordovician species known as Gruinkia canadensis, common to the Richmondian of the Cincinnati and series of Cincinnati area. And it varies in form from one that's largely cylindrical, at least towards the extremities, to one that's narrowly conical or even broadly conical. But the exterior is relatively smooth with minor growth irregularities, unlike some other species. And maybe not as much texture on the outside. And of course, a lot of the horn corals that you find were eroded before they were deposited, and so some of the outer wall of the corallite has been eroded away, and you're seeing some of the decepiments and so on. But a living one, a lot of that probably wasn't visible when it was alive. So I've made a couple of these, and we'll make 5 or more of them for a diorama that I'm working on. So as with any of these, the first thing you want to do is occupy the volume of the thing with something that, in this case, that can withstand heating. Aluminum foil, armature wire is often used, and aluminum foil. And part of that is to take up the volume, because the polymer clays, you generally, from what I understand, don't want to have them much more than about a quarter of an inch thick. If you get much thicker than that, you can get into problems, I think, with cracking and shrinkage and I don't know what all. But it also, with this cheap filler, you're not using up as much expensive product, i.e. the polymer clay. And so here I am taking and crumpling up aluminum foil and basically forming the general shape of the corallite. Now the polymer clay you want to condition before you use it, so it's going to be workable out of the package, but you want to kind of knead that like you would bread or something like that. Knead it real well. You can do that by hand with small quantities. It's even more practical and efficient to use a pasta maker, and you're one of them hand crank pasta makers, and you can run it through there a few times and that'll help condition it. But the pasta maker also is really convenient for making evenly or sheets of even thickness. And so I'm making a sheet of it that I'm going to use to apply around my aluminum foil form. And it's of course less than a quarter of an inch thick. You don't want it too thin. You want it thick enough so that when it hardens, it creates a nice durable shell. And so I work with that a bit until I'm satisfied that the exterior has a form similar to what I'm trying to model. And then, um, and I'm not going to worry about surface texture much at this point because I'm going to be handling the thing. And I would ruin the surface texture by continuing to handle it. So that'll wait towards the end. But I do then, after I have the corallite made, I made a sort of a mound on the opening of the thing. That's where the hypostome would be, or the part of the polyp where the mouth is, where the orifice where feeding takes place. And then I build up using a rolled cylinder of clay around the margin of the opening, and that's going to be the basis of where I insert my tentacles, which are going to have a wire armature in them, and I can insert that into the soft clay of that margin that I make there. But at this point on my hypostome, I can put the little I can create a little slit for the mouth and some other texture there. So the next step was to take some wire, which you can get at Walmart in the craft section or wherever. You can get some craft wire, and I'm making these slightly longer than the that I want the tentacles to be, because I want a little bit of that wire to stick out from the base of the tentacle so that it can be inserted in the margins of the opening of the corallite there. And so uh, I take a small amount of the polymer clay and I basically form it around the wire, and then I roll the thing into my finger so that it tapers to a point like a tentacle, which would be broader at the base and narrow at the tip. And I leave a little bit of wire sticking out of the base. And I made I think 12 of these or so. And then once they were formed, I inserted them around the periphery of the corallite's opening. And then once you put those in, then you have to blend the clay from the base of the tentacle to the corallite so that that clay is good and fused and there's not any uh, crevices or seams in there. You want to have that seamless so that when you bake it, you don't get any cracks and things like that. Then after the tentacles are all blended in, the polyp sits inside the mouth of the corallite. And so I take another cord of clay and wrap it around the base of the polyp and then blend that in so that the shell actually comes up around the polyp so that obviously the polyp appears to be inside and you have a little rim of the coral, the hard part of the coral coming up around it. And so I blend that in. And then the next step would be to add any final surface texture that you want to have. And again, that's going to depend on the species of coral that you're working with. And of course, you know, the corallite is just dead hard calcium material. And so it, even during life, it probably gets abraded and gets all kinds of epizoans on. I didn't put any epizoans on mine, but you could. So it doesn't have to be a perfect cone. It's going to have all kinds of irregularities in it and evidence of different growth form patterns and so on. And so I use one of the little spongy type tools to create some texture. And then finally, I'm going to arrange the tips of the tentacles the way that I want. So these would be obviously very soft, and they would be very flexible. And so you want to give the feeling that although they'll be hard after baked, you want to give the feeling that these are soft tentacles. And so I bend them around in different ways. Now, one thing I learned in this first trial with polymer clay is that uh, you're leaving fingerprints all over it, and they aren't very easy to see uh, after you're done handling the thing and before it's painted. And then when you paint the thing, you find out that there's all these fingerprints on there. And from what I understand, you can take a paintbrush with some aluminum or with some alcohol and kind of swab some of that on there, and that'll smooth out those fingerprints and that kind of thing. So when I'm happy with the general appearance of the thing and I have all my texture in, then it's time to go in the oven. And so the oven has been preheated to 275 degrees Fahrenheit. And you want to really not rely on your oven's temperature setting. You want to get a oven thermometer in there and make sure it's at 275. You may, in my case, the oven was running cool, so I had to up the setting on the oven until the thermometer read 275. In this particular case, the instructions call for 15 minutes in the oven. 15 minutes go by, carefully take it out because it's very hot, let it cool down, and you've got a nice hardened sculpture ready for paint. Now, as far as painting goes, I put on a base coat of white on this to reduce the number of coats of color that I had to put on. Some of the acrylics can be somewhat transparent. And so I had a base coat of white, let that dry. And then I chose sort of a bright orange, light bright orange color for the polyp, which is not uncommon in modern coral polyps. And I'm using the cheap, acrylic paints that you can get at the Walmart. This is Apple Barrel brand. I think they're less than $1 a bottle. And I took this color directly out of the bottle, but in most cases I'll be mixing to get the color that I want. Painted the polyp, and then the coralite, hard part of the coral, kind of a whitish base, and then I did a wash with a brownish gray, and dabbed some of that up with a paper towel. And then let that dry, and then dry brushed sort of a brownish gray over the top to bring out some of the texture. And then I went in with a little bit of green and dry brushed some of that on there to simulate maybe some cyanobacteria growing on the shell. The other thing that I did on the tentacles was to use a stippling brush and dip that in a very thin layer of paint and then tap it on a paper towel or something. You don't want it real wet and globby. But I use that to stipple some reddish dots onto the tentacles. But you have to be very careful that it's dry and you don't have a glob of paint on there. You won't get dots, you'll get globs, and that's not going to look very realistic. So here's the final product. Again, I'm not a professional artist, but it's, for my purposes, it's a reasonable facsimile of kind of what they might have looked like when they were alive, and will be I think, a nice addition to the Ordovician diorama that I'm working on.